Hey, church. Good morning, everybody. Great to see you in the house. Welcome to all of you online. We're so glad you're here. Guess what's coming up next Sunday? At the movies. Yeah, and for those of you who've never been here, we don't show a full-length movie. We take video outtakes from movies and bring lessons, real-life lessons to those. So church will still be about an hour. So don't get nervous about that. Some people get confused. But, hey, use this opportunity to invite your friends. It's a great opportunity to invite people that's never been church. Maybe they've been burnt by church or they just need to come back to church. Use this opportunity well. So that's going on next Sunday, as well as open house after each service as well next Sunday. What's open house? If we've never, met before, we'd love to meet you guys up here following each service, to meet our team and just to put a name to the face. See some faces out there. We have next Saturday, we have men's breakfast and our women's study. We are probably wrapping up a lot of our groups at this time. I want to thank everybody who hosted a group. It is so awesome. It's been a great season for that. But we continue on with our men's breakfast. That's Saturday. It's going to be a little different this week. It starts at 8 with a continental breakfast. We're going to be joining a simulcast that goes from 8 to noon. The women's study is at 9 a.m. still. Is that what time that is? 9 a.m. for the women's study. All right, ladies, take advantage of that. Church app. If you've never downloaded our church app, it's the best way to stay connected. You have an outline of each message. You'll be able to follow along with that. But you're able to see all the previous sermons and the news and the events coming up. And guess what? Did you guys see a cross that was standing up? We are no longer the church of the leaning cross. We are the church of the resurrected Christ. But Kevin and his team, thank you for making that happen. I know you wanted to hear that, right? Call you guys out. That's pretty exciting after all these years. Also, one other thing, make sure elections coming up, make sure to vote. Vote. AJ from our church here is running for school board, so just throwing that out there. So make sure to vote. As good citizens, we need to vote. Hey, if you're just joining us for the very first time, we're wrapping up a series today called Happily Ever After or Not, and it's been a marriage series. And I believe marriage is under attack today by the evil one and by culture, perhaps like never before. And in fact, there's diabolical forces that are actively seeking to dismantle the nuclear family. I just read last week, and I want to quote this. It says that, quote, traditional beliefs about marriage and family are rooted in bigotry. So there are organizations that are actively involved to destroy the family. And this is actually being taught in several states in our school system. So be aware of that. On top of that, we're already facing an epidemic of divorce. About half of marriages end in divorce. And we've been talking about the three institutions or spheres of authority that God's relegated to us on earth. And if any one of them is damaged, there's going to be chaos, and he's relegated authority to the government, to the church, and to the family. And so if he can destroy a marriage, I'm telling you, and that's where I believe it begins. So how do we have strong government, strong churches, and strong marriages? It's by following what he says. By following what he says, we've got to get this into our hearts and minds. We've been looking at a memory verse as well. Maybe you've chosen to memorize this. This is written to the husband. We're going to read this together. Ephesians 5:33. That's the address. Make sure you memorize that as well. Read this with me, will you? Each one of you also must love his wife as he loves himself. And the wife must what? Respect her husband. And over the course of this series, we've been looking at various marriages where we're just taking some of those applications from these marriages and applying them to our lives to be able to have a better marriage. If you're single, I promise you're going to be able to take something home from these messages as well. If you're joining us today for the very first time to cover what we've looked at before, in week number 1, we looked at the marriage of Jacob and Rachel and Leah. and we learned that if marriage is your answer, you're always going to be empty and dissatisfied because only God can fill that void. So we looked at God as our one, our spouse is our two. In week number 2, we looked at the worst marriage in all the Bible, King Ahab and Jezebel. And if you feel like you had a bad marriage, you left that day feeling better about yours. I'm telling you, because we looked at one of the biggest problems in marriage. That's of the passive husband and of the controlling wife. Last week, we looked at the marriage of Abraham and Sarah, who are described in the New Testament as being very, very faithful. But we learned that they had misstep after misstep along the way when life didn't go as planned. And we learned that God is rarely early, but he's never, ever late. And today we're going to look at a couple named Hosea and Gomer. And so I got to ask you, are you ready today for a challenging message? If so, say yes. Yes. Say, sock it to me. Sock it to me again. Remember, you asked for it. So I want to start off with just a couple of light questions to get us into today's message. How many of you plan one day on committing adultery, cheating on your spouse, and destroying your family? How many of you plan on that? How many of you plan on getting married, having kids, starting a family, and then getting in a bitter, ugly divorce? I mean, maybe that's your 5-year plan or your 10-year plan. No, nobody plans on doing these things. But about half end up doing both. Well, why is that? There's all kinds of answers. Statistically, they say that's what happens. One of the, I think, biggest problems that we have in our culture today, that we do a very, very poor job at preparing people for marriage. In fact, I would say that we do a very good job at preparing people for divorce. I mean, think about it. What has dating become? It used to be that marriage was reserved for certain things. There were certain things reserved for marriage only. But now sometimes the difference between marriage and dating is the simple fact of a ceremony, a marriage ceremony that has become sometimes just a formality, because now people, when they're dating, they do what married people used to do, right? The little things like saying, "Oh, I love you," to the big things like staying the night in the same bed, sharing the sink with a toothbrush, basically playing house, right? And so then when it doesn't work out, what do? They take their toothbrush and broken heart and they basically practice divorce. And after you've done that with 2 or 3 people, 8 or 9 or 18 people, or 22 people, right? It's no wonder that when things get tough, it's so easy to grab the toothbrush and what's left of your heart and just run and go. Modern culture has trained us well for divorce. And many of you who will be married one day, many of those who are married, you're going to face some bumps along the road. And the logic becomes, hey, when things get tough, I'm going to take my toothbrush and run. Now, with that in mind, let's look at this story. Very painful story, as well as a very beautiful story about this couple named Hosea and Gomer. Somebody say Hosea. Somebody say Gomer. Hosea is the man. Gomer's the woman, and she has a horrible name. It's not as bad as Hagar of last week, if you remember that. But we're going to see a marriage that had every reason to end in divorce. But God called them to do something different. So let me give you some of the context. The context of this is occurring about 760 years before the birth of Christ. It's under Jeroboam II. He is the king over the northern tribe, the northern province of Israel. And they were enjoying a time of unprecedented prosperity. But oftentimes, when often there's economic growth, there is spiritual and moral decrease. And that's what we see here. So God raises up a prophet named Hosea to speak against the spiritual adultery that Israel's committing against him. And the Old Testament book of Hosea talks about this very unusual story. So we're going to read, starting with Hosea chapter 1 with verse 2. When the Bible reads, "When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him," and he's going to ask him to do something very, very unusual. "Go take to yourself an adulterous wife and children of unfaithfulness." The Hebrew word translated there for adulterous wife is the word for harlot or prostitute. So he tells the prophet, go marry this immoral woman. Why would he do that? It goes on, "Because the land is guilty of the vilest adultery in departing from the Lord." They were in spiritual decline. It goes on. So he married Gomer, the daughter of De Blame. Can somebody say De Blame? De Blame became very famous years later when Fantasy Island became very popular. Tattoo every week would come out and say, what would Tattoo say? De Blame. I know that's bad. That's all I got. It's a heavy, challenging message. You got to, make stuff up. Those of you who are 45 years older, what's Fantasy Island? It's good that you don't know. Don't worry about it. Don't look it up. You're blessed because of that. Why in the world would God tell this young prophet to marry a prostitute? Well, this story has layers. I mean, layers upon layers. It's a very literal story between Hosea and Gomer about their relationship. We're going to see another layer to this as well, which is a picture of God. And God is loving his people, the Israelite people, who are very, very immoral. Another layer applies to us today, that God loves us even though we commit spiritual adultery from time to time and we sin against him. So through this story, there are layers and layers upon meaning. So I want to illustrate Hosea and Gomer's marriage in the context of today, if we could look at it through today's lens. If they're living today, I think it goes something like this. Boy meets girl. She's got a sketchy past. He's a preacher, and God tells him to marry her. So the preacher's thinking, well, if God told me to do this, everything's going to work out all right. And she's thinking, God finally sent me a man who wants something other than just one thing. And so they get married. They honeymoon like in Hawaii, and something happens there. They come back, and a few months later, she's like poochie, and it's like, what's going on? She feels the baby kick. Oh, we're going to have a baby. Is it a boy or a girl? They go do the ultrasound, right? No, there's a stem on the apple. It's a boy, right? So they're going through the names. What are we going to name him? We can't name him that. That's the name of an old boyfriend. Oh, can't name him that. That's the name of an old boyfriend. And down the line, because she had a lot of boyfriends, right? And they're doing baby showers. They're painting the room blue, which is exactly the color you need to paint it for a boy. And the baby's born, and she looks down and says, oh, he's got your toes. Oh, he's got your eyes. And they're dreaming of a great future together. And they're happy until they're not, because life happens. Just like life happens to everybody. His ministry picks up. He spends more time at church now than at home. She's resentful because he's not there enough. He doesn't even change the pooey diapers, and he doesn't even know how to change them. And she's upset because he's not taking out the garbage like every man should take out the garbage, because her dad took out the garbage, but he doesn't know that because she never tells him. He can't read her mind. And she's more upset. She's letting herself go. Her body's not what it used to be. The hormones are going crazy. Then one day something happens. An old boyfriend calls her up. Then she starts going down to the gym. She gets a trainer. He compliments her. She gets a part-time job. There's a really cute guy at work. Then the mailman shows up. One day too many. And something happens. And this woman believes the most common marriage misconception. This is the big lie. If you're filling in your outline and taking notes, this is the big lie. What I'm missing is better than what I have. What I'm missing is better than what I have. Oh, this person is pretty good, but they're just not delivering in every area that I need. Hosea chapter 2 and verse 5 says that she said, I will go after my lovers because they give me something he doesn't. Although this guy offers me a lot, there are a few things that he doesn't offer me that I want. So she does what people have done for centuries. She trades the 80 for the 20. One of the most foolish and most common trades there can be, trading the 80 for the 20. In other words, in a decent marriage, a person is going to provide you with 80% of your needs and expectations. That other 20%, they're just not going to be able to make it to 100%. You want to set a mate up for failure. You expect him to meet 100% of your needs. This guy was delivering about 80%, but there's 20% that she wanted, that she thought she had to have. And so since she doesn't have that 20%, she takes the 80% and trades it in and ends up with less than what she had to begin with. Now, in the man's world, it could be something like, well, there's this woman at work, we connect. There's a connection. She laughs at my jokes. She enjoys watching sports. We have all these things, in common? And they trade the 80 for the 20, believing the big lie. What I'm missing is better than what I have. And in ministry, I've seen this over and over again. And they come to my office. He or she, they're just not meeting my needs. I remember this lady came in 19 years of marriage. Setting it down across from me and just saying, he just doesn't meet my needs. And we're talking about that. And from the outside, I knew the couple. I'm like, gosh, 2 kids. It seems like a great provider. It just seemed like things were going great. And she's in my office. And I'm like, can you explain that? And she said, well, he doesn't write me sweet little notes like he did when we were in high school. I said, is there anything more? And there was. She had a whole list of them. But that was like at the top of the list. And she traded the 80 for the 20 because she thought she had more in common with this guy she just met. How can anybody have more in common than 19 years of history and 2 children with a man that's been faithful to her? But she thought the grass was greener somewhere else. Whenever you think the grass is greener somewhere else, it's time to water your own yard. Because I'm telling you, there's poo in that other yard, just like you think there's poo in your yard. You're just not close enough to smell it yet. And you're going to trade the 80 for the 20. And it happens all the time. What I'm missing is better than what I have. And this is what Gomer did. She betrayed Hosea. She went out and had a couple of affairs, had a couple of children with these guys. Eventually, she ends up going back into full-blown prostitution. She has an agent like, a pimp or whatever. And Hosea, his hurt is a spiritual representation of God's hurt when Israel committed spiritual adultery against him. And if you've ever been cheated on, you know the hurt and the pain that makes you feel. And this is how God felt. And so we're going to switch a little bit from spiritual adultery, or from physical adultery of Gomer, to spiritual adultery of God's people. And I want to look at 2 responses of God when there's spiritual adultery, because quite honestly, there's probably a lot of people that are sinning against God in such a way. What's God's response when we rebel and sin against him that we can learn from this story? Number 1, first, God's response is righteous anger. There is unrighteous anger, and there is righteous anger. And this is God now speaking to the people of Israel. Hosea chapter 2, verse 8. She has not acknowledged that I was the one who gave her the grain, the new wine and oil, who lavished on her the silver and gold, which they used for Baal. In other words, God gave them all this stuff, all these blessings, and they turned against him and went after false gods. It goes on, therefore, I will take away my grain when it ripens and my new wine when it's ready. I'll take back my wool and my linen intended to cover her nakedness. So now I will expose her lewdness before the eyes of her lovers. No one will take her out of my hands because he wants her back. And you can see God's pain. I mean, in the Old Testament, God says, I'm a jealous God. I don't want you to have any other gods before me. I want you to worship me and me alone. And God has every right to do that because he is our creator. But then he's like, you know what? If you want to do life without me, I'll let you do it. But see what that brings you, right? And I can sense God saying that even to our nation today. See how you can go without me and tell me how that works for you. And I think that we have been all abandoned him in the public arena in America, right? I mean, you look at how our nation was founded, one nation under God, but then we've just been trying to divorce ourselves from God, right? And we're replacing under God with all kinds of anti-God ideologies. And look at the results: chaos, craziness. The 3 spheres that God's established: government, church, family. You destroy one of those, what's going to happen? Chaos. I believe the church has been marginalized, being marginalized. The family is under attack. And I think our government is replacing our founding in God we trust. I can sense God saying to us in our own marriages, God might say, you know what, you want to do marriage without me? Go ahead and try it. You don't put me at the center, me as your one, your spouse as your 2. Let's see what happens. And reality is, you look at a lot of marriages and it's like, where's God in this picture? We're not holding hands and praying. We don't have him as number 1. And I would say that if you've ever been betrayed and you find yourself in that situation like we find God here, don't think if you're mad, it's like, oh, I'm being a bad Christian. No, there's righteous anger There's righteous anger. You know, we swore before God, you broke that, and I'm not happy about it. I kind of like that last phrase, no one will take her out of my hands. Ain't nobody going to steal her from me. It's like, devil, I'm telling you what, you're stealing my marriage? No. When I said something before God, I meant it, and I'm going to fight for this thing. But sadly, what have we been trained to do? Oh, when it gets difficult, I want to take my toothbrush and head on down the road. I've done it 18 times before. It's nothing unusual. When God might be saying, just because you had the grounds for divorce doesn't mean that you have to step over that line. I'm calling you to something greater. So God responds with righteous anger, but you read the story, he doesn't stay this way. He makes a shift, and it's a beautiful response to God's love for us. Point number 2, what's the next response? How does he respond when there's spiritual adultery? He responds to us like he does here in the story with unfailing love. A righteous anger turns into an unfailing love. Here's the shift. Verse 14. Therefore, I am now going to allure her. Now look at this. This is romantic. I will lead her into the desert and speak tenderly to her. There I will give her back her vineyards. I will make the valley of Achor a door of hope. Now, valley of Achor is literally translated trouble. Trouble. And what he's saying is, I'm going to make the valley of trouble, I'm going to turn it into a door of hope. Now, there's 2 ways to have a great marriage, right? Number 1, you guys do everything perfectly together, and you're going to have a perfect marriage. But you can't do that because you're sinners. I'm sorry to tell you that today, but that's the way that it is. So the second way is for us to walk through the valley of Achor together until the door of hope opens. In other words, you're not going to get everything that you want out of your spouse. And because, you sin, you mess up, and then you're going to need to repent. You're going to need to pray to God. You're going to come together and pray, God, come back to the center of our marriage. And then you mess up again. You got to walk through the valley again until you find the door of hope again. Some of the strongest marriages will walk through the valley of Achor, the valley of betrayal, the valley of adultery, the valley of pornography, the valley of rejection, the valley of deceit. But when you walk through it together with God at the center, leading the way, you always come to a door of hope. You always come to a door of hope. And some of you have probably given up on that hope, but you continue to pursue God, and you do that together. You will always walk through the valley of Achor, but you do that together and you will end up at the door of hope. And that's what we find in our story. If you fast forward in the story, Hosea shows his love for Gomer again and again and again. And she's out prostituting herself. And God gave a very challenging message to the betrayed spouse. And that's this: forgive and love as you've been forgiven and loved. God's message to the betrayed spouse today is forgive and love as you've been forgiven and loved. Such a tough message here. Hosea chapter 3, the Lord said to me, go show your love to your wife again, though she is loved by another and is an adulteress. Can we pause for a moment? How can he do this? How is this even possible? God tells us how. Love her as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods. Love her as God is loving us right now, even when we've betrayed him. Love her as God is loving us, even as we worship the idols of this world. How do you forgive? The same way he has loved and forgiven us. And listen, there's no guarantees in this story what Gomer's going to do. There are no guarantees that in marriage, your marriage won't end up in divorce. There are no guarantees that you do everything right. There's just no guarantees. But even though we can't control the outcome, God is so very, very clear on what we should do, and that is we're to love as we have been loved. We're to forgive as we've been forgiven. Now, that doesn't mean when you forgive that you become this doormat That's not what this means. It means, doesn't mean that if you reconcile that you don't have to lay down some new ground rules. It doesn't mean that you don't make some changes, but there are no guarantees. And that's the hard part of this story. Because I promise you, you get into a situation with your spouse, most every friend around you, they're going to say, dump him, dump the jerk, because that's what you've been trained to do. And it's only God that says, it's not time to give up yet. Now, my goal today is not to bring condemnation on those who've been divorced. That happens. You can't change that. But it doesn't mean that you don't go down without trying to put God at the center of your marriage again. And I know this topic can bring a lot of pain, a lot of emotion. And I don't ever want to stand up here and present myself, oh, my family, we got it all together. No, you come to our house at dinner time for an hour and just watch the dynamics there. So I'm not standing up here saying that it's perfect, but I told you last week, my wife and I promise you, we would have divorced in those first 3 or 5 years had it not been to our commitment to say we're just not going to do that. And there's been some tough years. There have been some tough moments. But this is what we've done over and over again and again. We have walked through the valley of Achor until God has opened up a door of hope. And I think about this testimony that I heard many years ago. It was a couple. He cheated on her time and time again. They divorced for years. They came back together. Years then later, they were teaching and mentoring couples in a church. After all that, years of this going on. And now they're teaching people how to stay together even with the deepest of betrayals. And somebody asked her, would you undo the adultery? And the wife said this, I wrote it down. I would never want anyone to endure what I endured, but I wouldn't change what I walked through for what I have now. That's what God can do to the door of hope when you walk through it. Now let's look at the end of the story. God tells his prophet to go and pursue this immoral wife. He takes his own money and he goes and buys her. He pays for his wife. And this is a picture of what God has done for us. Look at Romans 5:8. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this what? While we were sinners, Christ died for us. He shed his blood to purchase us back so we could know how much God really loves us. Now, we don't know how this marriage ended here. There's no record of what Gomer did. My thought is once Hosea bought her back, how could she ever betray that love ever again? How could they, when they hold hands, we've been talking through this whole series, hold the hand of your spouse and pray, God, we want you at the center. Even if you have things to be ashamed of, even if you have things to be embarrassed about, you do this day after day after day. You might be walking through that valley of Achor, but God's going to open up a door of hope. Now that's a tough sermon, but you asked for it. Let's pray together. Father, thank you for doing a work in our lives that only you can do. I pray that your presence would be so real, even as you promise in the 23rd Psalm, that we will walk through the valley of the shadow of death and we will fear no evil because you, O God, are with us. The valley of the shadow of death, the valley of Achor, the valley of desperation, the valley of depression, the valley of rejection, the valley of a struggling marriage, the valley of financial hardship, the valley of fear, the valley of self-doubt, the valley of guilt. God, we embrace you to open that door of hope. Teach us, O God, today to put our faith in you for the 100%, not somebody else. Help us, Lord, to submit to you as we love our spouse and forgive. For those who've given up on marriages, I pray, oh God, for that door of hope. And oh God, your Son has said, I am the door through which all may enter, that he's the way, the truth, and the life. I pray for anyone today who is still standing alone in this world, trying to do it their own way. When you're watching with